The situation that Miguel described is not unique. Chuck Nicholson, adjunct associate professor at the Nicholson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University, has been involved in another case where a systems approach guided more insightful decision-making, this time in the dairy sector. Please welcome Chuck as he speaks on this.
Okay, so thank you very much. Good afternoon. Before I begin talking about dairy, I'd like to actually say thank you to Julie for mentioning the journal Agricultural Systems this morning. I'll put on my editor hat and say, as the editor of that journal, if you are interested in publishing your agricultural systems related work in a journal that gets a lot of visibility and has a high impact factor, I'd be happy to talk with you. Okay, so that's my brief public service and self-promotion and kind of announcement. So I'm going to talk in a complementary way about work that it looks at regionalizing supply chains for dairy. Miguel is also involved, or if you want to say implicated, you can think about it that way. And I want to start out by pulling out of my magic bag here 2 different containers of milk. So first, how many of you live in a household where you've consumed this product, anybody in the household, in the last month? Raise your hands. Okay, so actually, you guys aren't the problem why the sales of this product have been going down precipitously over the years, so thank you very much. All right? Turns out this particular milk was bottled only feet away across in the processing facility. Okay? So get a sense for how you feel about this product. Then I have this other product. Same container, same basic product, but it came from a farm in Wisconsin. Okay, so my question is, which do you prefer? Olga, which do you prefer? Cornell. Cornell milk. Why? Because it's Cornell milk? Because Mike's taking care of the cows? It's the best milk. How is it the best milk?
We get it exactly from our farm. You know, the cell counts are really low.
I arranged especially so the somatic cell count in this milk is exactly the same. So which one is better now? Okay, I need to ask somebody else. Okay, somebody without a strong Cornell affiliation. So, Steve, you're from Dartmouth. Which one do you prefer?
Well, it looks fungible to me. I don't know.
Okay, I got to find somebody. Chris, another guy I know in the audience. Which one do you prefer?
I prefer the Cornell one.
Why? Okay, so suppose this wasn't Cornell milk, but it was New York milk. Would that make a difference? Since you're also loyal to Cornell. Oh, the same price. Yes.
And resources to ship it.
Okay, so which one would that be? Probably didn't want to live here.
So
cost.
I don't want to ship it across the country.
Why don't you want to ship it?
I don't believe it. That's illegal. I don't know.
Yeah, why don't you want to do that?
Cost is resources to ship the product. Why spend money in the gas to bring milk here?
Okay, well, Miguel also told us that you can produce pretty good broccoli in California and ship it all the way across the country. Right? That's like the competitive standard. But let's actually take a step back for a second. I wanted us to think a little bit about why we might prefer one of these products, and mostly people have frustrated my design to get you to focus on where something was made and how close to you it originated, right? So what I want to do is, we know in the Northeast that dairy is one of the largest agricultural industries. We have not quite a self-sufficiency in milk and dairy products, but we actually have a lot of our own consumption satisfied through production that happens in the Northeast states. One of the points that I want to get to is we often have a view that food produced closer to us has some positive attributes that food produced farther away from us does not. Now, this is not necessarily just my opinion or the opinions of others, but in many cases we think this is a better product in some way. Apparently, if it came from Cornell cows for Olga, it's definitively better, and there's no better milk that you can ever get, right? Lower cost was something that was mentioned by you, okay, for some obvious reasons that you don't incur some transport costs, but we can also think about, as Miguel mentioned, production costs. Better for the environment. And for policymakers in a state like New York, it's better for our economy to have the milk produced and consumed here. Of course, I underlined our because it kind of gets around the question of what about other people? But we don't care about other people because we're in New York, okay? And actually, New Yorkers kind of have that reputation, although more so downstate than in upstate. So often this is the perception of what is going on with the product attributes that are beyond, is this a safe product? Is it a healthy product? Is it the product that I wanted with the right fat content? Gets to those other production and socially desired attributes, right? One component of this is that states have taken to doing their own sort of more generic branding. Okay? State-promoted products. There's a conference on global food security going on down campus right now. I walked into the reception area last night, and they have proudly displayed all over the Pride of New York logo for sourcing all the products here in New York, right? I also worked in the state of Pennsylvania at Penn State. One of the big accomplishments for the dairy industry down there, from their perspective, has been to put this little label on all the jugs of milk with participating retailers that said, "Made in PA, it makes a difference." Okay? So we got to thinking about this a little bit, Miguel and I and somebody else who you'll hear from later on this afternoon. We said, well, okay, what happens if we were actually able to accomplish this goal that many people seem to have in their mind, including consumers and policymakers, of localizing the production, consumption, processing of fluid milk. And I'm here using the term fluid milk to think about things like this, which is packaged milk that would be consumed primarily through a food retailer or maybe through food service, distinguished from farm milk, which is all the milk produced on farms. So we'll talk about why that's important in a second. So we're using a set of Northeast states as a case study to examine what happens if you scaled up this idea of localizing production, processing, and consumption of important, as we saw from the number of people who live in households that consume fluid milk, an important consumer product, right? So we have to think about what we're going to look at. These are some of the commonly cited metrics, if you want, for performance of, I would think about it as food supply chains or food systems, as Mal Nishhan talked about this morning. Food miles is commonly talked about in the popular press. We can also think about supply chain costs. Greenhouse gas emissions have been mentioned on a couple of occasions already in this summit. We also wanted to look a little bit at the economic development component of this. So what's the growth in state GDP? I think like an economist that comes from localizing. And what kind of impacts do we generate on employment? Okay. So this is actually work that we did that was published recently in Environmental Science and Technology. Again, Miguel was involved. Oliver Gall, who's going to be in the session after this one. Interdisciplinary team of economists, supply chain people, engineers with a background in transportation. Where's Dave Barbeno? Dave doesn't really know that I was going to single him out, but actually some of the stuff that he talked with me about for the supply chain model actually came from thinking about how we relate farm milk to the production, processing, and dairy products. So we have a broad disciplinary scope for what we try to do here, which is consistent with, again, what Mal was talking about for food system analysis this morning. All right. Many of you may know this, but if you don't, so farm milk can be used in a lot of different ways. And typically it is brought into a plant and divided up perhaps several times, but most basically into the skim milk component and the cream component. So this is an overly simplified diagram that shows some of the physical flows that would be involved in taking milk from a farm and ultimately getting it into a product that would go to a buyer. Okay? So one of the things I want you to notice here is there are competing uses for milk, especially here in the Northeast where we have plant capacity that can make a lot of different products. So if I decide I want to localize one of those products and I'm going to use more milk to make that product, what happens to the amount of milk available to make the other products? Probably going to go down, right? that has some implications in a systems context for thinking about the total distances that products travel to us, right? So here, if I decide I want more milk to be processed into fluid milk and consumed in New York State, means I may have impacts throughout this entire other mess of stuff in terms of the allocation of that resource and what it does to a limited resource that's available to make different products. Okay? So we used a spatial systems model to assess this question. And this is a very simplified representation, but we have some spatial locations that are involved in the analysis here. Again, a focus on the Northeast. We start with the dairy farm. We look at the distance, the emissions, and the costs associated with moving that product to a processing facility. We actually also look in some detail at the processing, but that's not the emphasis of what we're talking about now. And then we look at the distance, the emissions, and the costs going to the consumer. Okay? So what we're trying to do is look at this from a broader national systems perspective, accounting for all the different uses and source locations for milk. And then what we did was look at what if we localize milk in the 5 northeastern states that can actually be self-sufficient enough to provide their consumers with packaged milk from their own milk supplies. Those states are Maine, New Hampshire, New York, and Pennsylvania. And we said, what if we said all the milk that was consumed in those 5 states would have to be produced, processed, and consumed there? Different from the way a supply chain might be organized now. We also looked at another scenario that had some regional subgroupings, but I'll let that one go for right now. Okay. So what do we find? Well, we found that the total miles traveled by fluid milk in New York, if we did this, increased by 11%. Increased by 11%. We found that total miles traveled by all dairy products in the Northeast increased by a smaller amount, but they still increased. We also found that there was a pattern of differences across the Northeast. This map is actually showing you, we can do this by individual consumption locations, what was the change in the total distance traveled if we localized fluid milk in those 5 northeastern states. And you can see Steve is sitting pretty up there in New Hampshire because their mileage decreased, and along with it associated emissions. But there's a broad swath of New York, Pennsylvania, and then actually a couple of hot spots where the distance has actually increased by a fair amount for those consumers. Okay. We also looked at CO2 equivalent emissions based on this, and they have some of the state breakouts here for New York, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and then for Northeast overall. The storyline again is that emissions were increased by adopting this broader perspective on state-based localization. Depended on the scenarios that we were looking at in a particular state, but a 7 to 15% increase in greenhouse gas emissions measured as CO2 equivalents. If you want to think about the economic activity, the story is actually a little bit positive here, but we're talking here 2 different scales shown on the left axis there. This is how many new jobs we created by localizing fluid milk, and this is including jobs directly in dairy processing, but also with multiplier effects in other industries. Somewhere between 2 and 4 new jobs in the entire Northeast were created by doing this. And we did increase the GDP of the entire Northeast by between $500,000 and $1.5 million. Okay? So let me actually then show you this by way of some kind of summary. I think there's kind of a conventional wisdom about what localizing food systems is going to do for us in terms of those other socially desirable attributes. And I would say most folks would expect that we see a big decrease in food miles. Associated with that would be supply chain cost reductions and emissions reductions. And we might, I put large in parentheses there because I'm not sure everybody would say really big, but they'd say, hey, we should see some kind of notable increase from undertaking this kind of endeavor, right? And that would be a motivation for policymakers in particular to do that, those last 2. Our findings are actually a little bit in contrast to that because we're seeing for those first 3, we're moving in a different direction than most folks, I think, would expect. And for the last 2, we're moving in the same direction, but the impacts are perhaps smaller than what policymakers would expect to see. Okay. And oh, by the way, it actually doesn't account for impacts in other geographical areas. We found actually that there was a big increase in the distances that some dairy products traveled in the southeastern United States and in Louisiana because of the regionalization, the restructuring of supply chains for milk here in the Northeast. Okay, so up to like 150 miles increase in some products for those consumers as a result of what we might try to do here based on state-based initiatives. There are increased supply chain costs, 1 to 2% overall, and decreased employment and income and other areas are possible if we undertake this kind of a strategy. Okay? So with that in mind, let me sort of sum up where I want to go with this by saying first what I don't think this tells us, and then I'll say what I think it does tell us. What I don't think it tells us is local food is bad. And we should put a big X or a big circle with a red line through the Pride of New York symbol, right? That's not what I'm trying to say. But I think what the message is that's most important for a group like this is that if we want localized food systems or any food system to provide us with those other socially desirable attributes, then we probably need to be a little bit more careful and systematic in our thinking and our analysis. We need to employ the right kinds of tools to be able to evaluate them. And in particular, I think a systems analysis is at least, if not essential, then very beneficial to facilitating this process. Okay? So I'm right about the time we were going to end. I'm going to stop for now. If there are a few questions that don't take us too far off track, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Sure, please. Start.
So what aspects need to be looked at to make it more attractive? So what aspects need to be more attractive to make it more attractive? You say,
Okay,
what do you look at?
Okay, so essentially what we're talking about is how do we do food system design, okay? So if we think local is a good idea, we want to support local economies, my approach would be to think about how do we convene the appropriate interdisciplinary group of people, get them thinking about this problem, think about the desired attributes, think about the potential interventions, and then through the understanding we have of the system, we can do the analysis that supports matching the interventions with the outcomes that we believe are desirable. That's a little bit different than saying, here's exactly what you ought to do, right? But that's, I think, what is necessary on a broader scale, and I think Miguel's work is a starting point for thinking about how that might work, dealing with the different attributes that will be necessary to develop a local broccoli industry, and I think that's why we're kind of complementary presentations here. Sure, Steve.
Part of the difference between broccoli and milk, just the
number of I'll call them co-products coming out of milk versus kind of broccoli, it's like broccoli, you know?
I think Miguel might take offense at that, but after 5 years of work on different broccoli varieties, he might want to weigh in. But I think that is one of the dimensions that is important. There's a lot of other competing uses for the milk supply. But I would argue there's sort of an analogy on the broccoli side that was actually mentioned by Nick, which is if we grow more broccoli, unless we expand the land base or intensify the production in some way, which might have their own downsides, then we will grow less of something else, which then might come from a longer distance because now it's gone back to California. Miguel, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't get that.
Okay, that's pretty much an economist's perspective on broccoli. Yes, other question? Sure.
I guess following up on that in the same line, is there any preference, when you analyze these different commodities, is there any preference to the consumer driving these decisions around what's fresh, what's perceived as fresh? When you ask the question about the milk, frankly, if I lived in India, I would drink corn milk, not for any of the other reasons, but my perception is that it would be fresher than something that was shipped from Wisconsin.
Okay. So, I mean, definitely we want our milk and other products, particularly those that are perishable with relatively short shelf lives, to be fresh. And I think you were actually talking about how there was a fresh dimension to the broccoli varieties that when grown locally, there's some different taste and texture characteristics that would be important for consumers. So I was trying to set this up as if these are equally fresh, and I would argue that for most kind of conventional fluid milk products, you wouldn't really notice a difference in the freshness based on, I mean, we're not bringing a lot of fluid milk from Wisconsin, but we could bring it from Pennsylvania or Ohio, and it's actually not really going to be that big a deal. So The freshness and perceived freshness may make some difference. I think one of the things that I think we have to come to grips with, and it was part of the previous session, is how much credence do we give to the consumer perceptions when those consumer perceptions are at best maybe not the best informed, okay? For particularly the purposes of making public policy decisions. So we want consumers to drive stuff for sure, but if consumers don't really know exactly what it is, that gets to be a little bit of a dodgy proposition, if you ask me. Other questions or comments? Other than stop. Okay. So yes.
I wanted to ask you about Greek yogurt, because that's been a big change in the dairy industry. Does that affect any of these things that you discussed, and does it affect the prices that the producers get?
Okay, I'll try and be really brief, and if you want to have a little conversation afterwards, I'd be happy to do that. Greek yogurt was a game changer in the state of New York in terms of the total new plant capacity that's come in over the last 5 years. I think it's also been a game changer in terms of people figuring out that when other people build a lot of capacity too, it can make it really difficult for you to have a successful product that has a sustainable life cycle. So yes, it actually did have some influences on prices paid and the allocation of milk in the Northeast. No, I wouldn't actually say that it's been such a driving force that dairy farmers in New York and elsewhere are thinking real happy thoughts about everything right now. Happy to talk more about it. I'll stop. Thanks a lot.